Know what is more dangerous than a gun to your head? A man in a designer suit thinking he can build an empire on your bloody past. At 38, I traded Middle Eastern black ops for the quiet of computer screens. But when my future brother-in-law mocked my shooting skills at a barbecue, he woke ghosts he could never face. I decided to show him absolute destruction without firing a single bullet. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now let's begin the story. My name is Genesis Black. The sun beat down on the sprawling lawn of the lakeside mansion like a physical weight, turning the afternoon of the 4th of July into a sweltering, suffocating display of newly acquired wealth. The air was thick with the rich scent of imported Wagyu beef, searing over an open flame, aggressively mingling with the sweet notes of designer cologne and the sharp tang of chlorine from the massive infinity pool. It was a picturesque scene of modern American success painted in the loud, desperate strokes of people trying very hard to prove they belonged at the top of the food chain. At the absolute center of this chaotic portrait stood Declan Vance. He was my sister's fiancé and the chief executive officer of Vance Tech, a private cybersecurity firm that had recently secured tens of millions of dollars in venture capital funding. Declan possessed the specific kind of unshakable arrogance that only blossomed in a room completely devoid of real danger. His smile was blindingly white and heavily practiced. His linen shirt was perfectly tailored to his shoulders, and his hands were impeccably manicured, having never known a single day of genuine physical labor or primal terror. He held court among a tight circle of tech investors, minor politicians, and social climbers, laughing far too loudly at his own mediocre jokes. He looked like a king presiding over a fragile kingdom of glass screens and compiled code. I sat alone in the deep shade of the patio corner, quietly sipping a glass of tepid, sparkling water. At 38 years old, my body carried a heavy ledger of debts that the summer heat always came to collect. Beneath my lightweight, long-sleeve shirt lay a hidden map of jagged, white-ridged scars, permanent souvenirs from my years serving in an elite special operations unit in the Middle Eastern deserts. Deep within my knees and shoulders, a chronic ache pulsed in a steady rhythm. With my heartbeat, a constant dull reminder of parachute jumps gone wrong, brutal forced marches, and long freezing nights spent completely still in the dirt. To the wealthy guests wandering past my table, I was just the quiet, somewhat intense older sister of the bride-to-be. To the civilian world, I was merely a senior risk analyst at Aegis Vanguard Solutions, a fictional-sounding corporate agency that provided a perfectly boring and visible civilian cover for my transition out of the military. I pushed papers. I ran complex probability models. I drank bad coffee. I disappeared seamlessly into the gray background, which was exactly where I preferred to remain. But Declan was a man who could never allow anyone else to occupy space without trying to turn them into a prop in his own ongoing theatrical performance. As the long afternoon wore on, and the glasses of vintage, incredibly expensive bourbon flowed freely, Declan's desperate desire for a captive audience reached its peak. He suddenly retreated into the grand house, shouting for everyone to pay attention, and emerged moments later carrying a long, heavy wooden case. With exaggerated flair, he popped the brass latches and revealed his newest, most prized possession, a custom-made hunting rifle. It was a truly grotesque piece of machinery. The stock was crafted from impossibly rare burl wood, polished to a sickening mirror shine, and the metal receiver was heavily engraved with intricate gold inlay. It was a weapon meant solely for a locked display cabinet, a status symbol utterly useless in the harsh dust and real blood of a battlefield. The surrounding crowd oohed and awed exactly as they were expected to. Declan lifted the heavy rifle, sweeping the long barrel carelessly across the crowded patio as he demonstrated his stance. It was a terrifying amateur mistake. My back muscles coiled automatically, defensive instincts honed through years of surviving the most dangerous places on Earth, screaming at my brain to cross the distance and forcefully disarm him. Instead, I took a slow breath and forced my body to remain perfectly still in the chair. Declan's eyes suddenly locked onto me, his predatory instincts catching my rigid posture from across the stone tiles. The copious amounts of liquor had emboldened him, sharpening his usual passive-aggressive digs into active public hostility. He needed to constantly elevate himself, and I, the silent, unassuming sister-in-law, was the nearest available stepping stone. "What do you think, Genesis?" Declan called out loudly, his voice easily cutting through the ambient chatter and the soft jazz playing from the hidden speakers. A little too much hardware for someone who spends 40 hours a week staring at spreadsheets. A few of the venture capitalists chuckled, swirling their drinks. My sister shot me a panicked, pleading look from across the grill area. I caught her eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. I would absorb this humiliation. I would not ruin her special day. "It is a very expensive piece of wood, Declan," I replied smoothly, keeping my tone perfectly flat, completely devoid of any emotional traction he could grip onto. My absolute lack of a defensive reaction only seemed to irritate him further. He stepped closer to my corner, cradling the gold-inlaid rifle against his chest. He desperately wanted a reaction. He wanted total submission in front of his wealthy peers. "Aegis Vanguard Solutions," Declan sneered, dragging out the syllables of my company's name as if they tasted sour on his tongue. "Risk analysis. You sit behind a desk all day long crunching numbers, calculating what might happen if someone accidentally trips over a computer power cord. It must be so incredibly tedious, right? Tell me, Genesis, in your wildly exciting world of paper pushing, do you even know what a safety catch is?" He paused deliberately, letting the heavy silence stretch out, ensuring every single important person on the patio was watching him expertly dismantle the quiet sister. He flashed his blinding, arrogant smile and delivered his final triumphant jab. "Can you even shoot?" The insulting question hung suspended in the humid summer air. I looked up at him. I did not look at the expensive designer suit, or the luxury watch, or the ridiculous weapon in his hands. I looked directly at the man underneath all of it, instantly evaluating his elevated pulse, his overly rigid posture, and the incredibly shallow depth of his actual courage. For a fraction of a second, the beautiful patio vanished from my mind. I smelled burning diesel fuel and spent cordite. I felt the sharp grit of the desert wind scraping against my cheeks. I remembered the heavy, deeply comforting weight of my actual service weapon and the lives of the men that had depended entirely on my steady breathing. I wanted to stay silent for my sister. But a man like Declan Vance would never stop pushing until he violently hit a solid wall of concrete. I slowly set my water glass down on the table. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. I leaned back in my chair, locking my dark eyes onto his, refusing to blink. My voice dropped a full octave, effortlessly slipping into a cold, commanding cadence that I had not used since I left the dark operations of the sandbox. "Wraith," I said simply. Declan blinked, genuine confusion momentarily shattering his smug facade. "Excuse me, what is that supposed to mean?" I did not repeat myself. The silence that followed was completely different this time. It was not expectant or theatrical. It was heavy, suffocating, and incredibly dangerous. Before Declan could open his mouth to launch another insult, a heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the stone pavers on the far side of the patio. Marcus Thorne, a distinguished older man in his late 60s, who lived in the neighboring multi-million-dollar estate, slowly got to his feet. Marcus was usually a genial, quiet neighbor who spent all his free time meticulously maintaining his large sailboat, but right now, his tanned face was completely drained of all blood. Marcus walked deliberately toward my shaded corner, ignoring everyone else in his path. As he approached my table, he reached up with trembling fingers and unbuttoned the cuff of his blue linen shirt, slowly rolling the sleeve up past his forearm. The movement revealed a faded dark ink tattoo deeply etched into his weathered skin, the trident, eagle gun, and anchor of the United States Navy SEALs. He stopped exactly 3 feet from my chair. He did not look at Declan. He did not even glance at the gold-engraved rifle. He looked only at me. His eyes were wide with a complex mixture of sudden shock, profound disbelief, and absolute staggering reverence. "My God," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling slightly, but carrying more than enough weight to completely silence the entire patio. "You are the one who covered us in the Korangal Valley that year." The hot summer air instantly froze. The loud laughter of the investors died in their throats. The soft clinking of ice and crystal glasses ceased entirely. The entire party was suddenly paralyzed by an invisible, overwhelming pressure. Declan stood completely frozen in the center of the patio, his mouth hanging slightly open. The expensive rifle in his hands suddenly looked less like a powerful symbol of dominance and more like a foolish child's plastic toy. The blood rushed violently to his face, painting his cheeks a brilliant, ugly red of absolute public humiliation. He had tried to assert his alpha dominance in front of his wealthy, influential peers, only to be instantly reduced to an insignificant speck by a man they all deeply respected over a quiet woman he had foolishly tried to belittle. I watched his knuckles turn pure white as he gripped his rifle tighter. His panicked eyes darted around the quiet patio, taking in the whispering, shocked guests, the absolute awe written across Marcus's face, and the cold, unblinking, predatory stare I continued to offer him in return. I watched the shame rapidly curdle behind his eyes, mutating almost instantly into a dark, toxic hatred. He had wanted to play a fun little game with me. He had wanted to use my quiet nature to climb higher up his social ladder. What Declan Vance did not understand in that humiliating moment was that he had just issued a formal declaration of war against someone who knew exactly how to systematically dismantle an enemy until there was absolutely nothing left to bury. The transition back to a normal functioning civilian life was a lie I meticulously told myself every single morning. 3 o'clock in the morning was always the most unforgiving hour. My bedroom ceiling offered absolutely no answers, only the heavy, suffocating shadows of a past I was trying desperately to bury. Physical therapy was a brutal, necessary ritual to keep my body from seizing up completely. 3 days a week, a clinical therapist manipulated my damaged shoulder and shattered knee, grinding bone against inflamed tissue. I endured the sharp, blinding pain in absolute practiced silence, desperately trying to wash away the lingering toxic tension from that sun-drenched July afternoon at the barbecue. I wanted that confrontation to be a closed chapter. Civilian life was supposed to be quiet. It was supposed to be safe and profoundly boring. But the sheer exhaustion of pretending to be harmless, of wearing a mask of corporate mediocrity, was infinitely heavier than any tactical gear I had ever carried across foreign soil. 48 hours later, my fragile illusion of safety was permanently shattered. I was sitting in my dimly lit living room, nursing a mug of bitter dark roast coffee, when a firm, rhythmic, and highly disciplined knock broke the quiet hum of my apartment. It was Marcus Thorne. He did not look like the relaxed, wealthy sailor from the patio party. He stood rigid, looking exactly like a seasoned soldier, bearing a grim casualty report. He walked inside without waiting for an invitation, his weathered face set in hard lines, and dropped a thick, glossy manila folder onto my glass coffee table. "I still have a few old friends working clearance reviews and background checks at the state capitol," Marcus said, his voice low, tight, and practically vibrating with suppressed anger. "You need to look at what your future brother-in-law is currently peddling to the government." I opened the heavy folder. The very first page hit me like a physical blow to the chest. It was a formal, incredibly slick bidding proposal for Vance Tech aimed at securing a critical state infrastructure security contract worth $30 million. And right there, dominating page 2, was my face. The corporate profile boldly listed Genesis Black, former elite special operations operative with the call sign Wraith, as the company's senior tactical advisor. The biography beneath my photo was highly embellished, full of aggressive buzzwords about military-grade threat assessment and lethal risk mitigation. Declan had taken the very history he had tried to publicly mock and aggressively weaponized it to legitimize his hollow amateur company. He realized the sheer weight my reputation carried in circles that mattered. He was actively selling my blood, my sacrifices, and my brothers in arms to the highest bidder without a single ounce of consent. I picked up my phone and immediately dialed his private number. He answered on the second ring, the arrogant smugness practically dripping through the cellular receiver. "Genesis," Declan said smoothly, his tone thick with false warmth. "I had a feeling you would call me today. I assume you saw the updated company roster we submitted to the board." "Remove my name immediately, Declan." I ordered, my voice completely dead and cold, a tone that used to make grown men freeze in their tracks. "You have exactly 1 hour to withdraw that fraudulent proposal, or I will personally walk into the State Attorney General's office and completely dismantle your entire operation from the ground up." A soft, condescending laugh echoed through the tiny speaker. "Oh, I really do not think you will do that, Genesis. You see, your sister and I just co-signed a rather massive bridge loan for the new estate and the upcoming wedding. $2.5 million to be exact. If you make a fuss and intentionally sabotage my state contract, my investors will panic and pull their funding. Vance Tech will be forced to file for bankruptcy by Friday morning. The wedding gets permanently canceled and your sweet, innocent little sister gets completely buried under a mountain of crushing debt she can never ever repay." He paused, letting the toxic financial blackmail seep deep into the conversation. "Welcome to the real corporate world. We do not use guns here. We use leverage. Be a good, quiet, silent partner, let my company win this bid, and everyone gets a happy ending." The line went dead before I could take another breath. He thought he had boxed me into an inescapable corner. He thought his financial hostage situation would force me into passive submission. He was operating under the fatal, arrogant assumption that I played by standard civilian rules. I walked slowly over to my dark desk, opened my heavily encrypted laptop, and cracked my knuckles. The dull, chronic physical pain in my joints completely vanished, instantly replaced by a cold, familiar, and highly dangerous hyperfocus. Declan Vance truly believed his cybersecurity firm was an impenetrable digital fortress. It took me exactly 14 minutes to effortlessly slip past Vance Tech's outer firewalls. His system was loud, clumsy, and deeply arrogant, exactly like the man himself. I bypassed the standard administrative protocols, slipping silently and invisibly into the core architecture of his highly praised flagship software program. I began pulling apart the source code, expecting to find bloated, inefficient corporate programming. What I found was infinitely worse, sending a cold chill down my spine. It was not his original code at all. Line by line, I recognized the digital signatures and the malicious architecture. The vaunted security software Declan was about to aggressively sell to the state government was nothing but cheap, highly unstable recycled malware purchased directly off a Russian dark web marketplace. It was riddled with fatal digital backdoors and massive glaring vulnerabilities. A moderately skilled first-year computer science student could tear it apart. If this garbage software was actually installed on the state infrastructure grid, it would leave vital public hospitals, emergency dispatch services, and regional power grids completely exposed to any hostile entity with a basic internet connection. Declan was not just a pathetic fraud or a greedy businessman. He was a catastrophic active threat to public safety. And as I stared blankly at the glowing lines of stolen, deadly code illuminating my dark, quiet apartment, I realized this was no longer just about protecting my sister or defending my pride. This had just become an active combat zone, and I was the only soldier on the field who saw the enemy clearly. Recognizing that the man I was dealing with operated entirely without a moral compass completely shifted my operational parameters. Declan was not just a greedy civilian trying to make a quick profit. He was an active threat masquerading as a corporate savior. I needed absolute, irrefutable proof of his massive fraud to sever his financial leverage over my sister without triggering the corporate bankruptcy he had threatened. Herewith, I brought Marcus Thorne into the fold immediately. The former Navy SEAL did not hesitate for a single second. We transformed my small, austere dining area into a secure tactical command center. Marcus utilized his deeply entrenched intelligence community contacts to quietly pull VanceTech's public vendor histories and government bidding documents. Meanwhile, I aggressively mapped out the digital breadcrumbs linking Declan's flagship software to the Russian black market forums. We moved entirely in the shadows, executing a flawless, invisible reconnaissance mission designed to map the enemy territory without tripping a single wire. But Declan possessed the paranoid, highly attuned instincts of a cornered predator. Within 48 hours, his internal network monitors detected the incredibly faint ripples of my probing. Instead of fortifying his garbage code or securing his perimeters, he launched a vicious, highly public counteroffensive. He did not confront me directly. Cowards of his particular breed never do. Instead, he deployed his corporate funds to hire a proxy group of mercenary hackers to systematically assassinate my character. Ugly, heavily fabricated stories began bleeding across highly trafficked military veteran forums and secure defense contractor message boards. They posted incredibly convincing forged medical documents, claiming the legendary Wraith had been dishonorably discharged due to severe, untreated psychological instability. The hired trolls painted me as a paranoid broken woman suffering from aggressive combat trauma, someone completely unfit for civilian employment, and entirely prone to violent, unpredictable delusions. They mocked the very scars I carried. The tactical goal of this smear campaign was incredibly obvious. If I tried to blow the whistle on his stolen, highly dangerous software, Declan would point directly to the digital smear campaign and dismiss me as a disgruntled, mentally ill relative trying to ruin his upcoming wedding out of pure, unadulterated spite. He was actively trying to isolate me, attempting to strip away my credibility before I could fire a single shot. He expected a volatile, emotional reaction. He heavily anticipated that I would aggressively defend my honor online, engaging in a messy, highly public screaming match that would only validate his fabricated narrative. He wanted a chaotic street brawl where he could control the narrative and play the victim. I gave him absolute terrifying silence. I did not log onto the military forums. I did not issue a single public denial. I went to work at Aegis Vanguard Solutions, drank my bitter office coffee, and maintained an outward aura of total defeat. My complete lack of response heavily fueled Declan's massive ego. Through the passive digital surveillance I had quietly wrapped around his personal mobile devices, I watched his internal company communications grow increasingly arrogant. He bragged to his board of directors that the family problem was permanently handled. He truly believed he had permanently crushed the fighting spirit of an aging, washed-up veteran. He forgot the fundamental rule of warfare. The most lethal snipers will gladly sit completely motionless in the freezing mud for days, simply waiting for the arrogant enemy target to take one careless step out of cover. I was not hiding in defeat. I was digging a trench and preparing a killing field. Working late into the night on a quiet Friday evening, I deliberately cracked open a microscopic, highly disguised vulnerability deep within the outer perimeter of the Aegis Vanguard Solutions corporate network. It was a classic honeypot. A digital bear trap meticulously painted to look exactly like an unsecured backdoor leading straight to my personal employee server. I baited the trap with incredibly tempting dummy files, labeled with my military call sign and personal financial records, making it an absolutely irresistible target for his hired mercenaries who were desperate for more blackmail material. Then I sat alone in the dark glow of my monitors and waited. The strike finally came at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. A massive barrage of automated intrusion scripts slammed violently into the fake backdoor. Declan's lead hacker was aggressive, incredibly loud, and pathetically sloppy, deeply intoxicated by the false sense of superiority their smear campaign had provided them. They breezed carelessly past the first layer of fake security I had laid out, eagerly downloading the corrupted bait files into their local environment. The moment their system grabbed my poisoned files, the heavy steel jaws of the trap snapped shut with brutal force. I did not merely block their pathetic attack. I seized their active connection and violently reversed the digital current. My customized countermeasure program sprinted down the secure tunnel the hacker had foolishly opened. It was a complete digital blitzkrieg. Before the arrogant mercenary even realized their primary firewall had been breached, I had completely hijacked their main terminal. I essentially turned their own computer into a wide-open, completely unprotected bridge leading directly into Declan's private, heavily encrypted financial servers at VanceTech. The speed of the operation was absolutely critical. I slammed through VanceTech's internal financial directories like a battering ram, my fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard in a rhythmic, deadly cadence. The large screen flashed violently as thousands of lines of encrypted data poured rapidly into my secure offline external drive. I bypassed his fake corporate ledgers and found the offshore bank transfers. I found the massive cryptocurrency receipts routed directly to the dark web malware vendors. I found the heavily manipulated tax documents and the massive hidden corporate debts he was actively concealing from his investors, just to keep his fragile company afloat. 12 minutes. That was the exact amount of time it took to completely gut Declan Vance's hidden empire. In precisely 12 minutes, I cleanly severed the connection, maliciously wiped my digital fingerprints from the mercenary's hard drive, and deployed a localized virus that completely destroyed the physical server they had used to launch the attack. I left absolutely nothing but dead air and permanently scrambled hardware in my wake. I leaned back in my heavy desk chair, the soft blue light of the downloaded files reflecting in my cold eyes. I now possessed the lethal ammunition I needed to end him. The warning shot had been fired with devastating accuracy, and the enemy was completely deaf to the sound. Decrypting the sheer volume of stolen financial data took exactly 3 hours of intensive processing. My customized algorithms chewed through the complex layers of dark web encryption, slowly peeling back the heavily guarded secrets of VanceTech. Beneath the offshore bank accounts and the massive hidden corporate debts, I located a deeply buried directory labeled simply with the word beta. It contained hundreds of raw operational logs. As my screens translated the hexadecimal codes into readable text, the blood ran completely cold in my veins. Declan had not merely purchased the volatile malware to sit on a shelf, he had actively deployed it in the wild to test its lethal efficacy. He had breached the municipal emergency medical dispatch system precisely 2 weeks ago. I read the server logs detailing the exact seconds he intentionally rerouted ambulance traffic, creating artificial lag in the computer-aided dispatch screens. He had purposefully delayed critical care to innocent citizens experiencing heart attacks and severe traumas just to generate a fabricated threat report to show his investors. He was playing God with human lives to inflate his fragile corporate valuation. But the dispatch hack was merely a sick proof of concept. The true impending nightmare was buried in an automated execution script scheduled for tonight, the very eve of the City Council's final bidding decision. Declan was preparing to trigger a massive simulated ransomware strike against the primary power grid of the Central General Hospital. His deranged plan was incredibly simple and utterly sociopathic. He would plunge the massive medical facility into total darkness, terrifying the city officials and the voting public, and then miraculously arrive at the town hall tomorrow morning with his flagship software, offering the only immediate cure to the chaos he had secretly engineered. He was perfectly willing to let patients on vital life support die just to secure a $30 million government contract. I glanced at the clock on my wall. It was 8 o'clock in the evening. Reporting this massive conspiracy to the federal authorities would take days of bureaucratic processing, and they would demand warrants and verified proof I did not possess the time to explain. The hospital grid would completely collapse at exactly midnight. I had less than 4 hours to prevent a mass casualty event. I threw away every single legal restriction and civilian boundary I had forced myself to meticulously adopt over the past 3 years. If I was caught breaking inside a critical medical infrastructure network, I would spend the rest of my natural life in a maximum security federal penitentiary. It simply did not matter. I pulled up the hospital's public network architecture and aggressively bypassed their weak, severely outdated perimeter defenses in less than 10 minutes. I was not there to steal data. I was there to build an impenetrable fortress. I rapidly constructed a heavily camouflaged stealth firewall, weaving an invisible digital net directly over the hospital's critical life support management systems, the neonatal ward monitors, and the backup generator relays. I essentially dug a deep fortified trench around the intensive care unit, setting digital tripwires at every possible entry point. At exactly midnight, the silent war began. I sat in the absolute darkness of my living room, the only illumination coming from the harsh, rapid flashes of code cascading down my 3 large monitors. I held a mug of coffee that had gone stone cold hours ago, my knuckles turning pure white as I gripped the keyboard. The first wave hit the hospital's outer servers like a heavy kinetic bombardment. Declan's automated script had unleashed a massive botnet swarm entirely devoid of any human hesitation or mercy. Blinding red warning lights flooded my screen as his malicious software aggressively sought the power grid controls. I deflected the first major breach, violently redirecting his data packets into a dead-end server loop. Then came the second heavy wave. Then the third. The attack was absolutely relentless, acting like a blind, heavy machine gun firing continuously into my stealth defenses. I countermaneuvered with brutal, calculated efficiency. When his software tried to isolate the power supply to the surgical wing, I shattered the command script into 1,000 useless pieces. When it attempted to corrupt the routing pathways for the emergency generators, I severed the connection entirely and rebuilt the wall before his system could even register the block. The hours dragged on in a blur of violent, high-speed keystrokes. My injured shoulder throbbed violently, a sharp physical agony screaming for me to stop and rest, but my mind was locked entirely into the combat zone. There were hundreds of fragile, innocent lives sleeping heavily in those hospital beds across the city, completely unaware that a quiet, desperate war for their survival was raging in the digital ether right above them. I did not blink. I barely breathed. I held the line against the mechanical onslaught for 6 agonizing continuous hours, treating every single server node like a soldier I refused to leave behind. The warm sun finally began to rise over the city skyline, casting a pale gray light across my exhausted face. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, the automated attack script finally exhausted its parameters. Realizing it could not break the invisible wall, the malicious code gave up and rapidly retreated back into the dark web. The hospital grid remained perfectly intact. My monitors glowed a steady, peaceful green. I took my first deep, shuddering breath of the new day. Declan's software had completely failed to breach the hospital, but his system was now blindly retracting its tentacles, assuming the target had simply been heavily fortified by a random security patch. He had absolutely no idea he had been fighting a highly trained human being all night. And he certainly had no idea that in the final chaotic seconds of the digital retreat, I had slipped something incredibly deadly into his own returning code. Before his connection fully severed, I had embedded a highly volatile, completely dormant logic bomb directly into the core architecture of his beloved software. It was a digital explosive charge wired tightly to the very foundation of his company, bypassing all his security alarms because he had unknowingly carried it back inside his own system. It was resting quietly in the dark, waiting patiently for a specific keystroke to detonate. I slowly closed my heavy laptop, the agonizing pain in my joints finally rushing back to the surface. The defense of the hospital was completely over. I stood up and walked toward the shower to wash away the exhaustion. The trap was perfectly set, and the public execution was scheduled for high noon. The main chamber of the municipal city hall was a suffocating monument to bureaucratic pageantry. Heavy dark oak paneling lined the high walls, trapping the stale conditioned air and the overwhelming scent of commercial floor wax. The grand room was packed shoulder to shoulder with ambitious city council members, eager local reporters, and the blinding aggressive glare of television news cameras. At the very front of the room, Seated behind a massive elevated mahogany desk sat the mayor, looking incredibly pleased to be the absolute center of attention. The entire space felt less like a functional government building and much more like a claustrophobic theater specifically designed to elevate a massive, elaborate lie. Occupying the absolute center of that grand stage was Declan Vance. He practically glowed under the harsh television lighting. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue Italian suit that probably cost more than my first combat deployment bonus. He moved across the podium with the slick, highly practiced grace of a seasoned con artist, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable confidence. Behind him, a massive digital projector screen illuminated the dim room with the sleek, aggressive branding of his flagship software program, which he had dramatically named the Iron Wall. I stood quietly in the heavy shadows of the hallway just outside the double doors, listening carefully as his amplified voice echoed through the chamber. He was delivering a masterful, highly polished pitch. He spoke smoothly about the terrifying rise of cyber terrorism and the absolute necessity for impenetrable municipal defense. Then, with a dramatic click of his presentation remote, the screen behind him shifted. My own face filled the massive wall. It was the heavily fabricated corporate profile he had constructed without my permission. He pointed casually at my photograph, using my stolen call sign to anchor his empty promises. He spoke at length about his company's deep integration with elite special operations veterans, assuring the gullible council that his Iron Wall possessed genuine military-grade resilience. He was wearing my stolen valor like a cheap carnival mask. He paced confidently across the stage, leaning casually against the wooden podium. "The battlefield has fundamentally changed," Declan announced to the captive audience, his voice dripping with condescending authority. "The modern wars of tomorrow will not be fought in the dirty trenches by broken men and women. We no longer need soldiers who only know how to hold a heavy rifle and blindly pull a trigger without knowing how to use their brains. The physical battlefield is completely obsolete. Today, the real heroes wear designer suits. We build the digital walls that keep your hospitals, your schools, and your infrastructure safe, while the old guard simply fades away into irrelevance." I pushed the heavy oak doors open. They swung inward with a low, groaning creak that briefly cut through his amplified speech. I stepped into the suffocating warmth of the crowded chamber wearing a sharply tailored, completely black suit. Marcus Thorne walked silently right beside me, his posture incredibly rigid, radiating the quiet, lethal discipline of a Navy SEAL preparing for a direct assault. We did not cause a loud scene. We simply walked down the long carpeted aisle and took 2 empty seats in the very last row of the gallery. Declan was mid-sentence when his eyes naturally swept across the back of the crowded room. He saw me. I did not glare or frown. I offered him absolutely nothing but a cold, dead, and entirely vacant stare. It was the exact same look I used to give the empty desert horizon right before a violent night raid. I watched the blood completely drain from his confident face. His blinding practice smile suddenly faltered, twitching violently at the corners. He stumbled over his perfectly memorized script, entirely losing his train of thought for 3 agonizing seconds before desperately recovering his cadence. He knew I was there, but he firmly believed I was completely powerless. He thought I was merely there to watch him win. The long presentation finally concluded to a loud wave of enthusiastic applause from the easily manipulated politicians. The mayor stood up, beaming brightly for the flashing news cameras, and loudly announced that the city was incredibly proud to partner with Vance Tech. A young aide rushed forward, carefully placing a thick leather-bound memorandum of understanding on the podium directly alongside a heavy gold-plated ceremonial pen. It was the final official contract for $30 million of taxpayer money. Declan picked up the heavy pen, his hands shaking very slightly with pure, unadulterated greed. He looked up at the back row, shooting me a rapid, triumphant sneer. He was mere seconds away from finalizing his stolen empire. Right as the gold nib of the pen hovered a fraction of an inch above the thick paper, a loud, incredibly sharp voice echoed aggressively from the far left side of the council desk. Hold on just 1 minute, Mr. Mayor. The entire room fell completely silent. The cameras immediately pivoted. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s slowly stood up from his leather chair. He was the chief security representative for the municipal council, and more importantly, he was a highly decorated Marine Corps veteran whom Marcus had quietly contacted the previous night. The man stared directly at Declan with absolute, undisguised contempt. "Mr. Vance," the security representative said, his voice booming through the quiet chamber without any need for a microphone. "You have spent the last 45 minutes telling us that your iron wall is completely impenetrable. You have aggressively used the faces of our combat veterans to sell us an absolute guarantee of safety. But before I allow this city to hand you $30 million, I refuse to blindly trust a slideshow. We need absolute proof. I am officially invoking Section 4 of the Municipal Procurement Guidelines. Right here, right now. I demand a live penetration test of your software." The mayor blinked clearly, caught off guard by the aggressive demand from his own chief security representative. He glanced nervously at the flashing red lights of the television cameras lining the back wall. Politically, he could not refuse a transparency check on a $30 million public contract on live broadcast. He cleared his throat, adjusting his tie, and nodded his heavy head. "Very well," the mayor announced, his voice lacking its previous theatrical boom. "A brief 5-minute demonstration of the system's resilience seems entirely appropriate before we sign." The Marine veteran did not look at Declan. He turned his weathered face toward the back of the crowded chamber and pointed a steady finger directly at me. "If this company is truly fortified by elite military expertise," the veteran stated firmly, "then I want the senior tactical advisor herself to try and break it." The entire chamber collectively held its breath as I stood up from the back row. The heavy silence was absolute. I walked down the long center aisle with slow, measured, and completely silent steps. My face was a mask of cold, unreadable stone. As I approached the elevated wooden podium, I finally looked at Declan. He quickly masked his initial panic with a thick, desperate layer of pure arrogance. He stepped aside, gesturing grandly toward the main presentation terminal with a mocking sweep of his hand. He leaned in close as I passed him, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "You are completely out of your depth, Genesis," he sneered quietly, his breath smelling faintly of strong mints and cold sweat. "You have exactly 5 minutes to try and crack a military-grade encryption wall on live television. You are going to humiliate yourself, and then I am going to completely ruin your sister." He was still playing the old game. He still fundamentally believed we were having a standard corporate hacking contest. I did not need 5 minutes. I did not even touch his expensive ergonomic keyboard. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored black blazer and withdrew a sleek, heavily encrypted black flash drive. Without breaking eye contact with Declan, I slid the metal connector directly into the primary USB port of the presentation terminal. I did not type a single line of aggressive code. I did not launch a brute force attack. I simply turned the key. The flash drive instantly communicated with the heavily camouflaged logic bomb I had secretly planted deep within his core architecture during the brutal hospital siege the night before. It took exactly 45 seconds for the absolute apocalypse to arrive. The massive digital projector screen dominating the room, which had proudly displayed the sleek, impenetrable blue logo of the iron wall, suddenly violently flickered. A harsh, high-pitched digital whine echoed through the chamber speakers. Then the entire massive screen turned a blinding, aggressive shade of crimson red. Declan spun around, his arrogant smile instantly vanishing, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his voice cracking with sudden raw panic. He lunged toward the keyboard, his perfectly manicured hands trembling violently as he desperately tried to regain administrative control. The system completely locked him out. His beloved software was not just crashing, it was actively detonating from the inside out. The crimson screen shifted rapidly, displaying massive, highly legible document files for the entire council and every single news camera to clearly record. First came the dark web purchasing ledgers. The screen highlighted exact offshore bank transfers and cryptocurrency receipts, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the $30 million iron wall was nothing but cheap recycled black market malware. Next came the forged corporate documents, displaying the fake invoices he used to trick his investors, followed immediately by high-resolution images of my stolen signature on his fake tactical advisory contracts. The chamber erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps and furiously clicking camera shutters. The mayor stood up, his face pale with rage, shouting for order. But I was not finished. I reached forward and tapped the enter key exactly one time to deliver the final lethal payload. The screen wiped clean and displayed raw, undeniable server execution logs. I had reformatted the data into plain, simple English so every politician and reporter in the room could understand the absolute monster standing before them. The screen detailed the exact times and dates his servers had intentionally hijacked the municipal ambulance dispatch grid. It explicitly showed the terrifying automated script he had launched against the Central General Hospital power network just hours ago. He had not just committed corporate fraud. He had actively endangered thousands of innocent civilian lives for pure profit. "Turn it off!" Declan screamed, his voice shattering into a hysterical, high-pitched wail. He frantically clawed at the terminal cables, trying to physically rip the power cords from the wall. "Turn it off right now!" "The contract is immediately canceled," the mayor roared over the deafening noise of the panicked room, pointing a trembling finger at the stage. "Security, do not let that man leave this building." Right on cue, the heavy oak doors at the back of the chamber burst open with a violently loud crash. 4 heavily armed agents wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed across their backs stormed into the room. They moved with swift, overwhelming tactical precision, parting the sea of panicked reporters. "Declan Vance!" The lead federal agent shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a heavy blade. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, cyber terrorism, and the malicious sabotage of critical municipal infrastructure. Get your hands where I can see them." Declan completely collapsed. His knees simply gave out. He fell hard onto the polished wooden stage, his expensive designer suit instantly wrinkling in a pathetic heap of absolute defeat. The agents descended upon him forcefully, wrenching his arms behind his back and locking cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. His entire fake empire, his pristine reputation, his wealth, and his physical freedom had been completely and entirely obliterated in less than 1 minute. As the federal agents hauled him roughly to his feet, Declan locked his wild, bloodshot eyes onto mine. He looked like a cornered, rabid animal. He thrashed violently against their tight grip spit, flying from his lips as he screamed vicious, desperate curses at me. He blamed me for his destruction, completely blind to the fact that his own boundless greed had dug this massive grave. I slowly zipped up my blazer and calmly walked toward the exit stairs of the stage. As I passed him, the federal agents paused for just a fraction of a second to secure their grip. I stopped exactly half a step away from him. I leaned in close, the chaotic noise of the shouting room fading away into total silence in my mind. I looked directly into his terrified, broken soul. "You asked if I could shoot right?" I whispered, my voice an absolute glacier of pure lethal ice. "I do not even need to touch a trigger to destroy you." I did not wait to see his reaction. I simply turned my back on him and walked away, letting the heavy federal machinery drag him out of the light and into the dark, miserable cage he so richly deserved. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out of the suffocating building, walking down the wide marble steps of City Hall. The bright late afternoon sun washed over my face, warm and incredibly clean. I took a slow, deep breath of the fresh city air. I had already called my sister this morning, explaining the toxic financial web he had spun. She was completely safe, legally severed from his massive debts before the bomb ever went off. At the bottom of the long stone stairs, idling quietly by the curb, sat a battered, reliable old pickup truck. Marcus Thorne leaned against the passenger side door, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked at me, a deep, knowing respect reflecting in his weathered eyes, and offered a slow, profound nod of genuine approval. For the very first time in more years than I could possibly count, the dull, aching pain in my shoulders completely faded away. I offered Marcus a small, quiet smile. The heavy, suffocating ghosts of my desert past had finally been laid to rest, replaced by a quiet, absolute certainty that I still knew exactly how to fight in the dark. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Vivian Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.